Hi everybody, I hope that you can hear me okay. My name is Sonja Soeterik. I'm a consultant clinical neuropsychologist working at Neurolink Psychology. I specialise now in working with people with traumatic brain injury, but in my past I've worked with many different clinical areas, including learning disability, people with dementing conditions and mental health needs. I'm also a member of the British Mental Capacity Advisory Group, so we produce guidance for our professional body on issues associated with mental capacity, and produce books such as this, What Makes a Good Assessment of Mental Capacity, and this one, Mental Capacity to Consent in Sexual Relationships, both of which we'll speak a little bit about today. I'm also presenting with my colleague, Dr. Emma Ferguson. Do you want to say hi, Emma?
Hi there. Yeah, my name is Dr. Emma Ferguson. I'm also a clinical neuropsychologist and I work for Neurolink Psychology alongside Sonja. As Sonja said, we primarily work with adults with traumatic brain injury. I've also worked in older adult services, learning disability and autism services. And as part of my role, I'm often asked to conduct mental capacity assessments, which include assessments around capacity to consent to sex.
So what we're going to speak about is largely mental capacity to consent to sexual relationships, and we're not going to speak about some of the other important issues about sexuality, such as how people feel about alterations to their body image if they have catheters or stomas or incontinence, how people manage sexual relationships when they have changes to their energy levels and their fatigue or motor changes, pain changes, those types of things. And of course, many people will have histories of sexual abuse, and that will have a ramification on their experience of sexual relationships with people. So I just want to kind of be mindful that those are parts, and very important parts, about supporting people's sexuality, but our talk is going to be much more specific in relation to mental capacity and sexual relationships. Obviously, the reason that we even start thinking about that as practitioners is that something's going on clinically in our practice. Concerns are starting to grow and raise. So we have this, on the one hand, presumption of mental capacity that somebody has it unless there is reason to suspect otherwise. And these assumptions that are starting to build amongst the people supporting that person, that there are real concerns about whether or not they may actually lack mental capacity to make some of these decisions. So we have initially some clinical concerns that come up. Then we have to use a legal framework of the Mental Capacity Act to try and understand what's happening for somebody. But actually that's just a framework. To use it, we have to use it in a practical, clinical way with people that we work with. And then we come to a conclusion with that, and sometimes that still needs to go to court in order for a legal opinion to be given about it. So it's kind of this real point where the clinical and the legal frameworks intersect, and we have a real challenge to think about that. So that's what we want to try and unpick a bit today. Sometimes it's pretty straightforward to establish if the person has mental capacity or not to consent to sexual relationships. It's the what you do about it that's a real problem for most practitioners on the ground. So that's our plan for the next hour with you. Excellent. So now you've heard our voices, you'll be able to recognise who's speaking. So obviously for many practitioners, this area feels just like a minefield. And when you speak with practitioners supporting people who are vulnerable, you often hear a lot of views and beliefs and attitudes that those people hold, that, you know, this kind of shouldn't have been an issue, it doesn't even really need to be discussed, it didn't happen when that person was of a similar age. They feel very anxious about how the person's wider family may react to decisions about their sexual life. Some practitioners feel that this is not why they went into this area of practice. It wasn't what they felt they wanted to do to support people. People may be concerned that clients we support are too childlike or too vulnerable, or it's just very dangerous. And certainly when there's a lot of physical disability, it's all very well that a person may have a sexual relationship, but then they need a lot of support to clean up and to make that, you know, hoisting and transferring and cleaning up. And whilst there are some carers who are happy to deal with poo and wee, semen is a different issue. So it can become quite complicated to think about how we support these people. I think one of the other things that you often hear from colleagues is that people feel very anxious about this being something that they could get into trouble about, or that they might lose their registration, or there may be challenges made about decisions they've made, and they can feel very anxious about taking them. So what's normal to know about? Well, dating in 2020 looks very different to dating in 1990. There's a whole range now of apps that is designed really for hookups. These are people who don't intend to have long-lasting relationships necessarily, and they may be just meeting for brief encounters that are going to be sexual. So certainly in my practice, support workers reported to me that someone had arrived at the front door unknown to any of them, and the client who had been sitting on their telephone had in fact been organising this all without anyone's awareness, and it suddenly prompted these concerns about, actually, was this safe and did the person have mental capacity to do it? Sexting has now become a thing, sending body part images to other people, and this is really problematic when the recipient is not known to that person, in terms of physically having met them. Sometimes they're unclear on the ages of people that they're sending images of their body parts to, and these could end up as having some kind of criminal ramifications for the person. Online video gaming also now involves cameras, and so it's possible that whilst carers are feeling that the person is safely contained in their bedroom, there's no other person physically present, that actually the computer games are matching people to play with, and it may be that that person is even in another country and encouraging the person to do something. I've had a reports in my practice where the support workers came in to find the female client almost naked while she was playing her video game, and every time she lost a life on her computer avatar, the person she was playing was making her do a forfeit of removing her clothing, and you have no idea whether they are screen capturing those images of her or not. So there's kind of whole new areas of vulnerability that we didn't necessarily think about before. Pornography has a much greater prevalence now in terms of being available online, on telephones. It's no longer just getting a lad's mag off the top shelf in your local shop. There's videos and YouTube and other channels that people are able to access this. And that also means that some of the education that people are receiving about what sexual relationships look like, how they take place, and those types of things are coming through this pornography channel. So even within mainstream, general adolescence, there's a lot of showing of images and sharing of images in school playgrounds. And that means much of their ideas about what women look like, what men look like, what kinds of things they might engage in has come through these channels. Of course, there are some parents who will have done some sexual education work. There are some schools that will have done some sexual education work, but many people are learning that through their peers. So when we have children who have had a different educational background, perhaps they've had a learning disability, perhaps they've had a brain injury where they've deviated from mainstream education, and those people, they may or may not be picking up this information. So the assumption that we might hold that people will have a basic level of sexual education knowledge sometimes is not accurate. And after the event of 50 Shades of Grey, suddenly there's a lot more knowledge about paraphilias and sadomasochism within the general public as well, and whether or not that's normal and acceptable part of someone's sexual practices or not. So who gets referred for these kinds of assessments? It's typically when there's been a whole growing body of concerns starting to be raised, where the presumption of capacity is starting to be unbalanced by the assumption that they may not have it. So I want to present to you two people. One is Nadine. She's 22 years old. She's from a very large conservative Muslim family, and she had a traumatic brain injury when she was 8 years old. She was repeatedly shown very violent pornography while she was attending her school, and she's hoping to find the love of her life. She wants to have children, she wants to be married, she thinks it's very important to be a virgin bride, but she's really also looking for somebody to have an intimate relationship with. She's been meeting lots of people online, she's been going to parties, and her aim of doing these things is to get out there and to meet somebody. And so associated with that comes all the risky behaviour that is engaged with it. She's giving out huge amounts of personal information about herself and where she lives. She's sharing naked images of herself online with these people. She's drinking a lot of alcohol, and none of us make our best decisions when we've got a lot of alcohol on board. She's getting into vehicles and going places with people she's just met and being somewhat deliberately misleading about her whereabouts, as she is kind of working with an idea that she has a trust-based care plan where she gives information about where she's going and she has her background support, but she's not where she says she's going to be. She's kissing people that she's literally just met, and she's reporting that she's had anal sex with a male friend that she had just met. So that in her mind means she hasn't really lost her virginity, and she has had sexually transmitted diseases or sexually transmitted infections. So there's questions about her that need to be answered pretty quickly. Nigel, on the other hand, is 22 years old, and his parents have separated when he was a young child. He has learning disabilities as a result of trisomy 21, so he has Down syndrome. There's no sex education on board in his life, and the assumption by his parents has been that that's really not necessary. He's very childlike, and there's no chance that a sexual relationship or a relationship of really any sort is on the future for him from their mind. He has what he calls a girlfriend, someone that he met at school, but since school finished and they got older and moved into different directions, he hasn't seen her again, but they text daily. He's really keen on finding himself a girlfriend, and he thinks that if he had a girlfriend, he would do things like go to the movies and kiss her. And he's receiving sexting messages from the woman that he knew in his school, and he seems pretty unaware of how to reply to these naked images that he's receiving from her. But he's been found masturbating whilst he's in his sitting room by the caregivers, who have reacted quite dramatically to what they have perceived to have been a childlike person who had no sexual life and no sexual interest, who was suddenly doing these sexualized behaviours. And I want to kind of put a little caveat there as well, which is you're often reported by carers about somebody masturbating, and when you delve into that, sometimes there are a whole range of things that have not been looked at. So people pulling on, for example, penises could well be indicators of urinary tract infections. They could be indicators of continence challenges. They could be indicators of infections and other things. And so it's often seen if somebody's doing something, you know, in the shower in the morning, every time we shower him, he pulls on his penis and we think he's getting off on it, he's masturbating while we're trying to wash and dress him. What you may find is that that person has no access to their groin at any other time. They're in an incontinence pad that's tightly done up with trousers that are tightly done up that they're unable to undo and access for themselves. So many young boys sit and hold their genitalia. It's a comfort thing. There are all kinds of reasons why people may be doing that, and it needs to be thought about in the round rather than just taking this direct, it's a sexualized act mentality. So I just want to kind of flag there are other reasons why people may do things, and we need to be thoughtful of that. So the first thing for us as people who are coming in to try and assess somebody's mental capacity is to work out if you're assessing the right question, because in real life all this stuff is very messy and it's all together. So what we're trying to do is to look at these multiple, and they are related ideas, but they're separate in terms of the mental capacity laws. So we may be asked questions about somebody's mental capacity to consent to sexual relationships, and then aligned with that is often questions about contraception, questions about parenting, should a child arise from that sexual relationship, questions about marriage, questions about contact, whether they are suitable to have contact with that person. So it's important to understand that you're assessing a question, because it's decision specific, not this totality of relationship management or human life or something like that, a personal life question. It's a question about mental capacity to consent to sexual relationships. So make sure that you're being really specific first off about what you're assessing. The next thing is to think about the context of why this assessment has come to the fore. And to do that, one of the first things to think about is your knowledge about this area, your knowledge about this person. What do we know about? Are they thinking about heterosexual relationships? Are they thinking about same-sex relationships? Are they thinking about both? Are they thinking about relationships with one person at a time or relationships with multiple people at a time? and to try and really get a sense of what is known about what's happening for that person, and your own knowledge about the Mental Capacity Act, your code of practice, and the case law that has formed in relation to mental capacity to consent to sexual relationships. And it's important that you're reflective and you're conscious about your own values, your own beliefs, your own religious and cultural influences that you bring into the room. You don't come in neutral as a blank screen to assess something. You come in with a set of ideas, which is they're human beings, they should have the right to do this, or these people need to be protected, or there are safeguarding concerns here, you know, this would play out badly in the Daily Mail. So whatever you come into the room with is going to colour the lens of how you do this assessment. And it's really important that you're mindful of what you are bringing into the room with you. It's important to have a level of comfortableness and openness with the language. And that is because you spend a lot of time saying words that you don't generally say in public. Vagina, penis, and things that can be quite difficult to get your mind around to talk about. So one of the things I often do is roll through a whole lot of the words before I go in, just so that I have a very non-reactive, permissive style as I'm talking to people about it. So try and get comfortable with words before you go in. It's really key to have a relationship with these people. You often are meeting them for the first time to talk about the most intimate, the most personal parts of their life, something that most of the time they're being told, don't talk about that with other people, that's a private thing. So you've got to come in and be able to establish a sense of psychological safety to be able to talk about these things with you, which is in essence a stranger to that person. And you need to be able to build that trust with the person and manage the issues associated with the confidentiality of that. There are many people who, particularly who've been in sexually abusive settings, who will understand this idea of secrets and not talking about things. And you may have to really put some time into preparing the groundwork of that assessment to think about, you know, sometimes these things can be very private and people feel that they're not allowed to talk about them with other people. Today is a place for us to talk about that, etc., etc. And it's helpful if you can try and get a reading on the values of the family, the service, the carers and the team that you're working within. Where do they sit on this permissiveness kind of continuum? Are they very risk averse? Are they very open and overly open? Are they people who are well balanced in their thinking about it? Because that's going to drive what they're presenting to you as problematic. It's going to drive how willing they are to support somebody with these needs down the track. So in preparing for the assessment, it's worth thinking about how are you going to introduce yourself, particularly if you're a stranger, how are you going to set up this type of discussion, and how you're going to promote psychological safety for that person to be able to enter into these really hard to have conversations. And I think it's important to consider the kind of trauma-informed practice points. Many of the people that we see will have had adverse childhood life events. And they may, particularly in learning disability, have significant issues of suggestibility. There may be social desirability factors here about what people think you should be saying and what sounds like is mainstream or acceptable to people to talk about. They may be acquiescent to people in power positions. So there are a number of factors that you're having to try and get a reading of within that assessment and balance and think about how you might tackle. You also should do some thinking about the language that you're going to use. Are you going to use your language for body parts and sexual acts? Are you going to use their language for it? Are you going to use biological names and language for it? Are you going to use slang words for it? So typically, you know, if you just think about breasts or mammary glands, they could be called tits, boobs, melons, baps, puppies, depending on who you are speaking to. And there's an importance in really getting ready for what might come your way when you have those kinds of conversations. My advice is always to use the language that the person uses, and if it's offensive to you, the language that they're using, such as, I would suggest to you that you try and talk about, so that we're talking, when you say that, you're meaning a woman's vagina, and then agree what you're talking about, and then you're fine to use whatever word you want to use. But it is important to try and make sure that this assessment is person focused, and so by using their own language, it's sometimes more helpful to you. That said, people sometimes have the wrong words for the wrong things, and it's important that you're clear when they're saying something what they actually mean by that. So practice using the language, practice managing your reaction to the language. It's important to think before you go on what type of materials you might need to help you with this assessment. Are you going to use simplified written information? So there's some people, for example, I've seen where they are able to read and they could use written words. So we might use post-it notes to write the types of different sexual acts that they're aware of. You know, sticking it in her mouth, sticking it in her body, sticking it up her bum, whatever they're going to say, I would write it down and put those things on the thing. So there's that's there and available visually for them during the conversation. Other people, it may be image based. You may need to use line drawings, things. It is important that you understand that it is illegal to show people images for your own sexual gratification. So it's important that you're not using pornographic images to show people or enjoying it, because that's the critical criteria. So thinking about, are you going to use words, are you going to use images, and where are you going to obtain those and how are you going to use them? Find out what you can about the person's sexuality and their preferences, because you're going to tailor the information for that person. So if the person is an older adult who has passed the point of menopause and the chances of pregnancy are therefore not on the table, that is not one of the parts of the salient information that will need to be relevant here. If the person is in a same-sex couple with another man, there is no need to also look at the pregnancy. So try and establish what you can, because that might be helpful to the type of assessment you're going to do. And then it's worth thinking about, how do you maximise somebody's ability to make this decision, and how do you maximise their comfort in talking about these hard to talk about things. So that might be to think about where that takes place. For example, for some people, seeing them in their own home may be most beneficial. For other people, particularly if one of their carers is an earshot, or they live with a parent who may be disapproving of the idea of them moving into this part of their adult life, that may be an inappropriate place, and you may wish to see them in their day centre or another location that makes more sense. I do see some people in my office about it in a separate location, and that's because I can control those conditions and who's there and the safety for that person much better. You may need to manage who is present. So there are lots of people who want to hear those types of conversations, and you'll need to decide about who should be in the room and who should not be in the room. It's really helpful if you can establish why this assessment has come about. What are the concerns? What are the reasons that have triggered this assessment? Particularly because it's likely to be a whole set of unwise things that have gone on, and you need to differentiate were they unwise or were they incapacitous. So the first step in the mental capacity assessment is to establish if the person has a disorder of mind or brain. Now, I'm presenting it in this way because that is how the Code of Practice originally set them out to do, but actually the recent case law has suggested that it might be more helpful to flip this. So to flip it is to say, does this person have a difficulty with taking the decision? Do they also have a disorder of mind or brain? And is the difficulty with this decision related to that disorder of mind or brain? So if you ask the questions in that order, it makes it much more clear that you're looking at an inability to take a decision coming from this disorder of mind or brain. By doing it the opposite way around, it can be very diagnostic. So you can just say, oh yes, they have a diagnosis of dementia, or they have a diagnosis of learning disability, and kind of fail to understand whether or not that is the reason why their decision making is not working. But I'm presenting it the opposite way that I've just told you to do. So if the person has a disorder of mind or brain, there's ways to establish that quite quickly. You can check the records and find out details about whether the person has had a brain injury or a dementia condition, a learning disability, whether they have mental health difficulties. And then you need to think about what's known about how that is impacting on their thinking skills. Are they having problems with abstract thinking and taking that into the bigger picture? Are they having problems with learning and remembering new things? Are they having problems with acting impulsively? Do they have difficulties with understanding the feelings or the intentions of others? And to be aware of the frontal lobe paradox, there was a recent paper by Melanie George and Gilbert in 2018. And the frontal lobe paradox is where a person in a well-supported conversation where that is, not time pressured, all of the relevant information can be supported and you can build a scaffold around that decision, can take a decision, but then in real life is doing the absolute opposite. So it's known as the knowing and doing discrepancy. And it's called a paradox because on one hand they appear to be able to do it, but on another hand they're walking the walk in a totally different way. And so that is a well-known problem, particularly of people who have difficulties with executive functioning, difficulties with their frontal lobe. And it can be an explanation of why people appear to be passing, particularly in my world, cognitive tests, but in the real world are doing something different. So you need to be really conscious of, are they just saying this, but their behaviour is showing us a different understanding about what they're doing?
And just to add, I'm going to just briefly talk about a young man that I assessed last year around the issue of capacity to consent to sex. I was asked to assess a couple, so obviously I needed to separate out A, the couple and assess them individually, and B, what the different questions were, as Sonja has previously talked about. So the young man, I'll just focus on him as an example for demonstrating what we're talking about. So this is a young man, I think he was around 28, 29 at the time of the assessment. He'd contracted herpes simplex encephalitis at the age of 6, which had then led to an acquired brain injury and a diagnosis of epilepsy. So when thinking about, does this person have a disorder of mind or brain, that's kind of where my starting point was in terms of reviewing his medical history and the records around what the difficulties were for him. And thinking about how his acquired brain injury and epilepsy then impacted on his thinking skills. There are reports of him having difficulty with remembering things and learning new information, with emotional regulation and making decisions based on kind of impulsive or emotionally heavy reasons. And he also presented with some executive function difficulties and impulsive behaviour at times. So those were things that, whilst planning the assessment and thinking about whether there was a causative nexus, that I needed to take into consideration.
So then we start to think about the functional part of this test, which is, can this person understand information relevant to this specific decision of having sexual relationships? And the first step is to know the salient information for this decision, and as Nicola outlined, you need to be able to check that the person understands the mechanics of the act, that they consent to doing it, that the person they're having sex with consents back, that sex between men and women can result in pregnancy, and that's a reasonably foreseeable consequence, and that there are health risks that are reasonably foreseeable, such as sexually transmitted infections that can be reduced if you were to take actions such as to wear a condom. So that is not going to be relevant for every client, because remember, we're tailoring to the individual that we're assessing, and as Nicola described it, we're expanding, contracting and adapting for the person's unique situation. So we've got to try and think, what do they actually have to understand? They don't have to understand all of these other factors that are important in relationships. They just have to understand these specific things in relation to the Mental Capacity Act. So the best way to tackle it, I think, is to start with just open-ended questions to begin with, to determine what somebody already knows. It isn't a memory test. So if they don't have the information up front, you are required to provide it to them. You have to help them to understand it. So if they haven't had that information in their previous life and they don't have it and built and ready to give you, then you're going to have to teach it within that meeting. It's useful if you record answers verbatim, because I always include direct quotes within my reporting, because that shows the voice of the person and their skill level through the reporting that I subsequently do. And if I'm saying that the person had a rudimentary or basic knowledge of this, then I kind of put in the description of it. That will really help to illustrate how that looks. And obviously, I've just said we're going to teach any additional information as part of maximising capacity. So how did that look with your guy, Emma?
So I guess taking a quick step back for this particular example, when I showed up, I needed to really address the issues around what I was there to do, what we were there to talk about together, because the couple had been told something a little bit different. They had concerns around whether they might be able to have a baby together or not, and they'd been told that the lady, when she shows up, will tell you that you can't look after a baby, so you can't have sex. which was not the assessment that I was there to do. So just in terms of setting up, that was really, really important. In terms of the young man that I was referring to a few moments ago, we started off with a very kind of general conversation, the three of us, myself and both members of the couple, to think about what kind of things we were there to talk about and to sort of set the context around we're here to talk about sex, contraception and marriage, which were the three questions. I'm just focusing on the question around sex today. I then separated the couple and we had individual conversations, and the starting point for the young man was to think about what kind of sex education have you already had, what do you already know as that starting point, keeping it super open before then going into more specific questions, which I think we'll be talking about in the next couple of slides.
So you may be familiar with this sex and the 3 R's, rights, risks and responsibilities, the sex education pack. It has a series of these kind of line drawings, and they're ways to kind of facilitate conversations between you and the person that you're trying to assess. And they give you a way of looking at the person's emotional literacy and their comprehension, their ability to look at non-verbal cues and information without having to use leading questions or adding words or concepts that they then just passively agree to. So I would set it up and say, look, these pictures may be a bit embarrassing, or there may be some words that you don't understand. We can stop at any time. You can ask me any questions. And so that allows you to work at a rate and a manner that fits with that person. But for example, with this image, you might be able to explore with them their understanding of the nature of relationships and emotional literacy. And what do you see that's happening here? How do you think he could be feeling? Does he like what's happening? Do you think he's agreeing to what's happening? If you were that person, what would you be thinking or feeling? It gives you a way to explore the person's kind of understanding of those things. And ways of kind of ascertaining, does the person understand the information relevant to the decision? You could ask questions like, can you tell me a little bit about what having sex means? What does that mean? What do people do when they have sex? What types of sex do you know about? What kind of health problems can happen when you have sex? What would happen if you didn't use contraception? Do you have to have sex if you don't want to? How would you be able to tell that someone you didn't want this? How would you be able to tell if you didn't? How would you tell someone if you didn't want to have sex, or you wanted to stop, you didn't like it? How would you know if someone wanted to have sex with you? And how would you know if somebody didn't want to have sex with you or wanted to stop having sex with you? So you can ask questions that enable an opportunity to kind of explore what they know and what they understand.
And so with the example I'm talking about, I used some of these types of questions and then recorded verbatim the sorts of things that he was saying. So, for example, when I asked what happens, what do people do when they have sex, he was in a heterosexual relationship with his girlfriend. So he just simply said the man's dick goes in the woman's vagina. So it's very clear. In terms of health risks, and I sort of asked what kind of problems can happen, health problems can happen if you have sex. He said you can get STDs if you have sex, and he talked a bit about his own experience of having contracted chlamydia in the past and some knowledge about what you can do about that and who you can go to for help. He was also able to demonstrate when I asked what could happen what could happen if you have sex with your girlfriend, what other consequences could there be? He said when you have sex, then the woman can get pregnant. And he was also able to demonstrate that he understood that he had the opportunity to say no, and also that his partner had the opportunity to say no. So, for example, he said, usually I want to have sex, but sometimes my girlfriend doesn't, or she's tired. So I just say, don't worry about it, babe, it's not a problem. So he was able to say that even if he wanted to, he understood that if she didn't want to, then they wouldn't be able to have sex together. So those are just the sorts of things that I included in my reporting, as Sonja's described, just to make it really clear what kind of words, language, understanding he was demonstrating through the conversation in the assessment.
So the next part of the functional test is being able to hold information in mind long enough for the purposes of making a decision. So you don't have to remember it for 5 days, you just have to be able to hold that information long enough for the purposes of the discussion you're having with the person. So there's ways that you can really support people with that. You might keep the key words that you've written down, like I described, the post-it notes in front of the person so that they can see them and touch them and point to them as needed. They can then think about what the relevant facts are that you're talking about. So it's possible then to try and make sure everything's laid out for the person in order to hold the information in mind for the discussion.
And again, with the case example, this was somebody who was able to communicate and understand verbal information. We did make, given the information I received before the assessment about him having some difficulties with remembering information and learning new information, we did keep some written notes on the table in front of us, some quite basic things that I was then able to direct him to if he lost the train of what we were talking about, and wrote down some of his verbatim quotes, some of the basics for him to then refer back to see if that's kind of what he meant, checking back. It was also useful to see that he was able to draw upon pre-existing knowledge around sex education and relationships. So this is also something to take into consideration when he's holding that information in mind, because although the conversation and the assessment was new to him, the basic information about sex was not. It was something he'd learned through his schooling and his education and through previous relationships.
So the next thing that we're required to do is to assess whether or not that person is able to use and weigh the information that's relevant to making a decision about having sex. And we're trying to establish, can the person take on all the information and use that information? So it sounds so simple, but it's actually a really hard thing to try and work out. And I think one of the ways to do it is to try and look at how they're balancing information and adding in and supporting the person to consider the other perspectives and other information that they may be not thinking about. So if they kind of just present part of it, then you can add, some additional questions around it to help them to think about more broadly other factors associated with it. So, for example, if somebody said to you, I don't like using condoms when I have sex, it's not as good for me, the sensation's different, I don't feel good, I don't like having condoms, but my girlfriend could end up with a baby or give me a sexually transmitted infection, so I have to wear it. That to me would be a pass, right? This person understands that this is a way to prevent pregnancy and prevent sexually transmitted disease. They understand that pregnancy could result, and it's a way to prevent a health thing. They may say something like, if I say yes and they say yes, then it's okay. So that's somebody demonstrating an understanding of the consenting from both parties required. If somebody says, I don't need a condom because I never get sick, that to me would be a clue that they're not using and weighing the information correctly, and not believing information relevant to the decision as well. And the kind of nuances of human relationships, which are far more complicated, which is some girls say no, but they really mean yes. So how you might be able to support someone to think about words and conduct coming in a line to thinking about issues in relation to consent. So you're looking to see, can the person take on other perspectives and information when you're providing it. For example, I don't need a condom, I never get sick. You might say, so the condom can be helpful against what types of STDs do you know about, what types of sexually transmitted infections do you know about, chlamydia and gonorrhea, and do a kind of a list with people, HIV, whatever, the list of things that they may then understand, and then say, how would you stop getting these infections if you were having sex, and see whether then they would be able to take that extra information on.
And in the example I'm discussing, there's an example of the client understanding the information and then forgetting parts of it and using reminders to support him to use and weigh that information. So, for example, in the assessment, he said, sex is something that you do with the person you love. It's fun. It's part of a relationship. And then later on he said, but it's not great having to wear condoms and stuff because it can feel uncomfortable for me. He then said, well, what's the point of having sex if you don't want a baby? So I was able to then remind him, using the written information, earlier you gave me these other reasons for having sex. Where does that fit in for you? And then he sort of took his time and was able to say, well, if you want to have sex but not have a baby, then you do need to use protection like a condom. Having the baby isn't the only reason to have sex. So we checked it out a few times. So giving that support to be able to use and weigh within that assessment rather than just taking the first answer is really important, because people might lose track of where they are in that conversation or not be able to hold it in mind without that extra support, which we've discussed previously.
So the final part is that the person must be able to communicate a response by any means, and they may use, for example, eye gaze. They may be able to spell out words using their eyes. They may point, they may use gesture, they may draw an answer, they may write an answer, they may speak, they may type, they may use Makaton or sign language or other things. And just a word of caution about the use of interpreters for this. You know, these deeply private, intimate parts of life, often you're sent an interpreter who is a mismatch for that conversation. So I remember doing one with a young South Asian woman, and they sent me an old South Asian man as the interpreter. So right from the off, you could see he considered in very disapproving terms that this conversation was going to take place, and I just terminated the attempt with him because I felt that he was presenting my questions in a tone that I think conveyed what she should be answering, so rather than just doing a direct translation. And so I think it's important to think about those types of factors about whether or not, if you're using a third-party interpreter, that is another factor that's leading into the type of assessment. So you're looking for any way that a person might communicate it. Sometimes I've used the post-it note approach with line drawings or the keywords, and then I've asked them to move them into things that are relevant or not relevant to the decision for them. Sometimes you can physically ask them to move in their wheelchair. You know, what would you decide if that happened? Would you do yes, go to that corner? Would you do no, go to this corner? So there's always a way that you can typically get them to answer. And at the end of the assessment, it's really important that you tell the person what's going to happen next. I normally say, I'm going to go away and think really hard about all the things that we've talked about and that you've shared with me. And then I'm going to write a report that's as long as my body. So I would thank them for being really open to talk about these things. I would thank them for being willing to share these thoughts that they have with me. I'd ask them if they have any questions or worries about what they've said or what might happen next or what we've talked about. And I often ask if they think it would be helpful to have any more information about sex and relationships, because sometimes it's the first time that there's been a permissive person willing to talk about these things with people. And many of you will be familiar with the explicit model, which is a way of how we interact with service users about issues around sexuality. And part of that is that you start with being permissive, that this is an appropriate conversation to have, and that it's a part of human life, and it's a part of things that people will have thoughts and questions about and need information about and support to work through things. So that's another way of thinking about how that might be set up for people.
Mm-hmm. And with the couple, I assessed some of the outcomes were around the girlfriend in the couple wanting a bit more information about different forms of contraception and wanting more opportunity to talk about that and think about that. And for the boyfriend in the couple, he'd referred to problems and not finding it comfortable to wear condoms, and actually he was having some difficulties in really knowing how to use and wear condoms. So it was recommended in my report that they had some more information and education as a couple about how to do these things, how to use contraception and what to use when they were having sex.
So at the end of that assessment, you will have thought about, does this person have a difficulty making a decision about having a sexual relationship? Is that problem that they've got due to a disorder of mind or brain? And is the reason that they can't make a decision that disorder of mind or brain? And you're going to then come out with what I consider to be one of three outcomes. You're going to say, I just can't decide right now. I don't have a sense that there's enough opportunity for this person to maximise their capacity being done. And you may recommend that there's an educational program put in place to support the person to just learn a bit more before you reassess that type of thing. You may decide that the person does lack mental capacity, and that's because of the disorder of mind they have, and that's the causative nexus. But remember, as Nicola said, there's no best interest process about this. If they lack capacity to have sex, they lack capacity to have sex. That's it. No one can say, actually, she would really like the guy in room 12. Let's hook them up. No, if they lack capacity, they lack capacity. Or they're going to have capacity in spite of this disorder of mind or brain that they may have. But that's typically not the end of the story, and I think that's where we fall down a little bit as professionals sometimes. If the person has capacity, you hear people say, oh, well, they have capacity, that's it, you know, they can carry on now even though you're concerned about what's happening. So somebody may have capacity and still be vulnerable, and safeguarding may still be required, and now further assessments of mental capacity for other decisions like contact or residence or contraception or marriage or future parenting, whatever, may now be required. So I think the other element is that somebody may have capacity and need an educational program. So there may be some things that we now need to do about sex, loves and relationships workshops for this person that might involve things about thinking about locations where it's acceptable to have sex. Is it acceptable to have sex in the sitting room of your shared group home? Is it acceptable to have sex in the local park? Is it okay to have sex with your care worker, even if they're consenting? Is it okay to have sex with somebody who's underage? Is it okay to have sex with your sister? So you start to try and help the person to learn more about their sexual functioning and their sexual partners and choices. And to think really about the curly issue of consent. You know, what if somebody is drunk? What if you're drunk? What do you do about, you know, if you wanted to stop? Who would you get help from? Where would you go if you were worried about this? Who could you talk to about these things? And to think about the emotional consequences of sexual relationships. You know, it's all well and good that people are supported to get onto online dating, but a lot of online dating ends in no second date. And for people, that can be a really distressing thing. So there's some support that's needed to think about how to bounce forward after something has not worked out in the way that they might have hoped, or to think about how they are going to respond when the person that they have been having a relationship with in the group home is now having a relationship with someone else in the group home, and the feelings of sadness and anger and jealousy and other things come up for them, how they're going to tackle those types of things. These are not required for the mental capacity to consent to sex, but they are required in our practice to support people to evolve their sexual functioning and support them in that way. So if we come back to the people that I spoke about at the beginning, Nadine and Nigel, what we found for these people was they both had mental capacity. After they had been seen and assessed, they both had mental capacity. And as you can see from the risk behaviours that we spoke about at the beginning, they have mental capacity and they're vulnerable and there are safeguarding concerns, and this is now cueing us to think about additional mental capacity assessments that might be needed for these people. So our work hasn't stopped just because we've assessed them as having mental capacity to have sex. So this next part, we wanted to just do some thinking with you about managing the risks and supporting sexual functioning in practice, because the reality is if somebody lacks mental capacity, then we have to put safeguards around to stop them from being in a position where they are doing it. If they have it, then we've got this huge job of trying to manage the risks associated with that. So we need to think about in the care plans for that person, do they need the skills training and the sex and relationships training? Do they need enhancing in skills and saying no and assertion? So one of the challenges of, for example, teenage pregnancy is not a lack of knowledge that having sex will lead to babies. but a problem amongst particularly young girls in saying no and being able to be assertive and not being seen and talked about on social media in a way that's going to make them a pariah of their social network. So sometimes people have the knowledge, but they need the assertion to be able to manage saying no, and the self-esteem to be able to do that. So there may be some enhancing of skills and assertion and self-esteem. We need to support people to think about their sexual expression, and there are many people who will request things such as sex aids, devices, pornography. They maybe want to watch adult movies, they maybe want to look at adult images and how those things are supported in the living environments that they are in, and how those things are done in a private way, and how care staff come and go or interrupt or don't interrupt when these things are taking place. And we need to think about people's social media skills training, the dating sites they're using, the social networking sites that they're using, the risks and responsibilities about using those social media web platforms. We need to think about provision of necessary items for people. So sometimes they need support to purchase the items that they may require. Condoms, for example, having them available in the locations where they may need them, in the environments that enable both privacy but safety. So if you don't have sufficient private space, then people are beginning to engage in these high risk things in locations where it is possible for them, and that's when they're generally in less safe settings. So think about whether there are other issues now that need mental capacity assessments, residence, contact, contraception. If somebody's going to be sexually active, then their sexual health becomes a significant part of their health plan, just like it would for anybody else. They need regular health screening associated with that activity, and some safety plans for people to think about emergency responding and what might happen if there was a problem for them, what might happen if they missed contraception or they needed emergency contraception provided. And sometimes it's worth thinking about supporting that within the context of the place that they're in. So there may be specific pieces of work that need to be done with people's families to think about how this is going to be made okay for everybody who has to be part of it, and maybe that's about working with support workers or carers to think about their role in this and their responsibilities in this and their recording of things and what might be appropriate for them to do. So I'm giving a shout out to the document I was involved in writing here, the Capacity to Consent to Sexual Relationships. What's helpful about this document is it does address not only those core parts about assessing mental capacity, but also the risks and our responsibilities as health and social care professionals supporting people to live a full life and how we tackle some of those challenges. So I signpost you to this. I think you can just download it for free on the internet.
So a really helpful part of that document, from my perspective at least, and I assume from Sonja's, is this framework that's been presented by two psychologists, Herbert and Palmer, a few years back, and it talks through some different sort of domains that you might want to consider when you're supporting someone with issues around sex and relationships. So this is a framework that I've used actually with Nadine, obviously a pseudonym, to help support what happens to her and how to support her relationships after that assessment. So I'm just going to briefly talk through some of the issues that were particularly important for her and some of the things that as a team we've been doing to try and support her. I hope this is legible, but as Sonja said, it's available in the document and it will also be available on the slides that we provide after today's talk. So there's these 6 different domains, narratives around relationships, what the intellectual disability or cognitive impairment might be. So that ties in with what the disorder of mind or brain is and what the specific ways that impacts on someone's thinking skills are. What their knowledge and education around sex and sexual relationships is, how they're able to assert choice and what that means for them if they need any additional skills training, the organisation and the family context that they find themselves in and how the views and attitudes of people in that context impact on their ability to have relationships and their opportunities to meet people. And also the physical environment, which also includes opportunities to meet people perhaps in different environments and opportunities to spend time with a partner or with someone they want to have some kind of sexual relationship with. So for Nadine, who's the first example that Sonja presented from Nadine and Nigel, lots of really complicated issues, and for me in this instance, this was a little bit different. I was able to do the mental capacity assessment as part of my routine clinical work as her treating clinical psychologist. I wasn't coming in cold, as you like, to do this assessment. In contrast, the previous example with the couple, I was just there for the assessment and then went away to do the report and recommendations. So the approach is slightly different, but it's always really important to make sure that person is as comfortable as they can be. So for Nadine, she'd had her brain injury as a child, and she'd attended non-mainstream education. She'd attended a special educational needs boarding school. And so she'd been quite used to being in sort of 24/7 care or different sorts of settings, where lots of people were there to tell her how she should be living her life, and lots of, I guess, perceived control over her decisions. So this is really important to think about in terms of our next steps, with her wanting to meet someone, her wanting to have relationships, but how does she navigate this when she's in this particular power kind of dynamic with the systems around her. She'd, as Sonja's already said, she'd been exposed to some quite violent pornography while she was in this boarding school from other students. And so her very first experiences of thinking about what sex looked like and what people needed to do when they had sex was really skewed by this. So I think this may have even come before her formal sex education, which I believe was quite limited in this particular setting. She has a range of different cognitive impairments, but some of the main ones that are particularly relevant around sex and relationships are impulsivity, finding it difficult to assess and become aware of risks around her, some difficulties with emotion-based decision making and sort of learning from mistakes and then updating how she does things on the basis of previous experiences, kind of not really feeling a gut feeling about whether something's right or wrong or safe or not related to her brain injury, and also quite high social desirability. So for Nadine, whoever she sits in front of, she has a tendency to mirror that person's style, mirror their language. So really important to actually collate a range of observations of her, the things she says that she wants to do from different people and in different environments. As I've said, in terms of her knowledge, she had quite limited sex education at school, that had found out more about sex from this pornography, but then subsequently from other peers, from her sisters, from TV, from the internet. So she was using a range of different materials to get some information that was accurate and some that was potentially not so accurate. So one of the pieces of work that we did as a team with her was around sex education. We called it a Love, Sex, Relationships project. And this was supplemented by discussions with different members of the team, holding in mind the fact that she presents a bit differently depending on who she's with. We also did some work on assertiveness, as growing up in this environment of different specialist services and a very vocal family with strong views. Nadine really struggled to really know her own mind and know what she was thinking and whether it was okay or not to disagree with other people, particularly those she perceived as being in power. So a large part of the work has been around developing assertiveness skills and practicing and trying out asserting her views to different people in her teams. Sonja's mentioned that her family context, she grew up in a really large, lots and lots of siblings, large, very traditional Muslim family, but in West London. So for her, she also had siblings who were kind of grappling with the difference in approach from her traditional parents, but also the Western environment that she found herself in. And part of the work was around working out what's kind of normal for this family. How have her siblings negotiated these different, the ability to have relationships when perhaps mum and dad are feeling more that it should be done in a certain way. So just to help us to understand what's kind of normal for her, and we call it the family code. How do you normally do things as a family? It's also been really important for Nadine. She has a 24-hour support worker team. It's been important to work out how those support workers feel about her relationships and about what she's wanting to do. So, and doing quite a lot of training with them around checking your own beliefs, checking how that might be impacting on your approach with Nadine, and thinking about what we're comfortable with doing in order to maximise her ability to meet people and do the things that she wants to do in terms of her relationships. And the environment. So Nadine's reflected that living with a 24-hour support team has actually given her more opportunities to potentially meet people than if she'd been living at home with her mother, because of the differences in views. And the way that we started was actually around watching the programme First Date and looking at the types of conversations and relationships that people have in a sort of real life TV environment, and getting her to know the types of things that she would like to share with others and what she feels is appropriate and not. It then progressed to very well supported with support workers speed dating, so you could kind of compare notes, and trying to help her to select events or things that she wants to go to, with the idea of trying to meet people, but in a reasonably supported environment. When she has had relationships, we spent a lot of time putting together particular care plans and looking at risks and coming up with agreements around places to spend time together, and balancing privacy versus the risk, and making sure that we know that she's safe, given that Nadine has sometimes not always been truthful about where she is and who she's with. So it's been really quite tricky to sort of balance that, and it's been, I guess, specific to each particular scenario. So, for example, some members of the team got to know the man that she'd become close with and wanted to have a relationship with, so that he was aware of that there was a team in the background. And we made some arrangements around kind of times that they could have on their own in her flat, or times that and how she would ask for help, how we would know if there was a problem, and really went through it in a lot of detail. This is not Nadine. This is an example as F it's also from the British Psychological Society document that Sonja's referred to. And this is just another way of presenting some of those different factors and domains from that framework that we've just been talking through. So thinking about the context of the relationship, what's the knowledge, what are the facts that somebody understands, what are the opportunities for choice and saying yes or no to things, what are the particular factors related to brain injury or learning disability or other cognitive issues, what are the opportunities that there are for somebody to meet somebody or to have privacy, and what are the views and the setup of the family and the organisation, how are things practically going to work. I don't know if you have anything else to add on that, Sonja. We're just coming towards the end.
No, I don't. The other thing that I would say is that COVID has made this complicated. So for some of my clients, there was pretty confusing government information about what they should or shouldn't be doing initially. And so I had a number of people who were continuing to use Tinder right up, in fact, until the lockdown became more clear about what was expected of them. And so at that point, we could see that there were really high risk factors for them in meeting people, particularly that they didn't know and didn't have any ability to subsequently contact again. COVID has also meant challenges for us as clinicians. So the Court of Protection did allow a groundbreaking move that we might make these assessments online. So a number of mental capacity assessments are possible to do in this kind of forum now using Teams or Zoom or a safe end-to-end encryption service. But I think what you have to think about is whether or not that's really the most suitable way to have that type of conversation. So there will be some things and some people where that is quite possible, and there will be other people where that's not. And I think that speaks to the individualised nature of this assessment, which is you need to do it in the best way to maximise that person's abilities and understandings. That said, wearing a face mask and a visor and an apron and gloves and seeing someone in their home is not necessarily better than to be in person, because that can make all kinds of difficulties in terms of communication and being able to use facial expression to communicate with them. So it may be that there are some parts of that assessment that you would want to do in person and some parts you would want to do online. And then, of course, there are just some things that are time limited, practicalities, pragmatics of this type of work, which is you may just have to do what's doable rather than what's ideal. So we have a list of useful references for you here. The first one relates to the image that I showed you, the sex education pack for working with people with disabilities. The second relates to the document that we've shown you. The third relates to Siobhan Palmer and Camilla Herbert, who are neuropsychologists who developed that model of thinking about how to support relationships and rehabilitation. Melanie George's paper there on the frontal lobe paradox. And SHADA, who you may or may not know, which is the Sexual Health and Disability Alliance. Their website has a number of useful links. They have links around what challenges may be prevalent for people with Asperger's or multiple sclerosis or stomas or amputations or whatever. And they also have links to TLC, which was formerly part of the Outsiders group, and they also have really helpful information about sexual aids, people who provide sexual services for people with disabilities, etc. So it's a place to signpost you to explore in your own leisure.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that really, really useful presentation there. And I'm just having a quick look here at the questions, and I think we're going to welcome back Nicola. So we have a panel for everyone listening and an opportunity for us to answer some of the questions. So Nicola, perhaps if it's okay, we'll start with you. And there were a number of questions that came through. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at them. Shall I read them out, or you've got them? So I'll hand over to you to start with those.
Yeah, so the first question that came through was one where it was asked, in the case of a couple where one person may later develop dementia, how can we determine that sex will be consensual for that individual in such a relationship? You know, and this is a really interesting question, because this is the kind of thing that arises a lot, and I'm sure Sonja and Emma have got experience of this and might have something more to say on it after me. But the difficulty with this, of course, is that capacity, as I said in my talk, is time specific. And the fact that you have capacity to do something now does not mean that you necessarily have capacity to do something in future. And I suppose if you think about it, in the sense that there's a difference between the criminal and the court of protection test, and I gave you Baroness Hale's quote where she talked about, in the criminal law you can't see anything clearer than you're consenting to sex with this act of sex with this person at this time. And obviously, in terms of your capacity to consent to sex, in terms of the court of protection, it's prospective declaration, but you wouldn't want a situation where you assumed that, you know, Mrs. Smith has capacity to consent to sex, and then her dementia progresses and actually she may have changed her mind, capacitively or otherwise. Her wishes or feelings might be different. You can't then work on the assumption that her capacity continues. Colleagues of mine, one of my colleagues, Alex Keane, who's a real specialist in mental capacity and does a lot of work on this. And in fact, I should have said, we have a newsletter in my chambers that I'd recommend you all sign up for if you're interested in this area of law, because it's free and we send it every month and we put a lot of work into it and it just tells you all the new law. But Alex Keane has been discussing in sort of academic circles the possibility of the idea of advanced decisions on intimacy. So the idea that you could, if you knew you had an incipient condition like dementia or progressive Huntington's or whatever, that you might be able to put on paper, you know, that you wish to continue an intimate relationship with somebody. But at the moment, I can't see how the law actually accommodates that. But as practitioners, I think the sensible thing would be to, you know, monitor the situation and see how individuals are expressing their wishes and feelings, and whether they are continuing to intimate a wish and desire to continue that relationship. And then, of course, tailoring the test, as I've been talking about. So, you know, they do still need to be able to give consent and understand that the other person is consenting, but do they still need to understand the possibility of pregnancy if they're 80-year-olds? Possibly not. I don't know if Emma or Sonja has anything that they wanted to say on that.
Totally agree. It's time specific. So at the point that they are demented, that is the time to do that assessment, not at the point where the initial diagnosis comes. And in practical terms, when somebody's in a residential care centre and they're wanting to have sex with lots of people, staff, gardeners, cleaners and their husband, that's probably a clue that actually there's no discrimination to the person that they're maybe looking for. So it's always a very curly issue, and I think sometimes the question is asked by the staff, and actually the person who's seeking the intimate relationship is the non-injured partner. That's about their loss and grief and adjustment to all the changes that are taking place, rather than the person who has a dementia who's seeking that themselves. So it's context, I think, as well, that's quite relevant.
Okay, so the next question I got was, you said in cases that was in court, capacity cannot be separated into self-contained silos. So where we have P able to consent to sex but not to contact or intimate relationships, how can P be safeguarded? Also, if P says yes to sex with A and the conditions to have sex is facilitated for them, what if P decides against a sex action whilst in the room with A? There's no way to safeguard her at that point, as the care worker will not be in the room with P, so how can these be managed? Now, I do just want to say, if you are presenting me with an actual case that you have, you must not take anything that I say as legal advice, okay? If you're really worried about it, you can come to me as a lawyer or you know, anybody else, but I'm answering these questions in general terms, so I don't want anybody to go away and go, oh, that barrister in there. Anyway, so with that caveat in place, you've talked about not having capacity to consent to intimate relationships, but I think perhaps that's not quite what you mean. I think realistically, if P is considered to have capacity to consent to sex, then they will have capacity to consent to intimate relationships. I can't see how you would have capacity to consent to sex, but not for, you know, sexual touching. That to me logically doesn't really make sense. But of course, you're right. You could have capacity to consent to sex, but not to contact. And Mr. Justice Hayden talked about this in the case of Tower Hamlets and NB, and I did give you the quote, but I'll give it again, where he said, it's not the objective of the Mental Capacity Act to pamper or nursemaid the incapacitous, rather it's to provide the fullest experience of life with all its vicissitudes. This must be kept in focus when identifying the appropriate criteria for assessing capacity. It's not to be regarded as applicable only to a consideration of best interests. So, you know, if you think that P understands the salient elements for sex, i.e. the mechanics of the act, that sex with heterosexual sex can lead to pregnancy, that it can cause disease, that they have a choice and that they can say no, and that the other person is consenting. The fact that there may be dangers inherent in them engaging in a sexual relationship does not mean that they don't have capacity. There are dangers for all of us when we engage in sexual relationships with people, and I think it's important to bear in mind that you're attempting to empower, not to differentiate between those who are disabled and those who are not. But in terms of how you protect P while they're in a room with somebody, this is the issue that was grappled with by Mr. Justice Baker in the TZ case. How do you protect an individual who has capacity to consent to sex, but not capacity to decide whether or not somebody is safe? And I would suggest that the care workers who work with somebody can put in place certain safeguards to ensure that they're not meeting strangers, that they are meeting people in a safe place where they can call for help if need be. But also, most importantly, and that's a message that we get from the CH and Metropolitan case, is that those who are providing care to the vulnerable, to people who lack capacity, must ensure that they're appropriately educated and empowered, because the exercise capacity of capacity is not dependent on how much you know. If you don't know enough, then you can be taught. It's whether, having been taught that material, you can understand it, retain it, use it, and weigh it. So the key then, I would suggest, would be, if you have this client, you make sure that she understands about sex, you make sure that she understands about safe sex, you make sure that she understands what her rights are, what consent is, and then you take it slow. But there's a point at which, if P has capacity to consent to sex, then preventing her from having sex is also unlawful. I don't know if Sonja or Emma have anything to come in on that.
I would tackle it the opposite way around. So if somebody has mental capacity to have sex and they're in a room and you're worried that they've changed their mind, they've withdrawn their consent, and the person they're with forces them to have sex, that's a criminal act, that's rape. So I think that's the subject, of the criminal law in the same way it would be for all of us. If all of us have capacity to consent to sex, we change our minds during it and someone forces us, then we've been raped and we have recourse through the criminal courts about that. I think in practical settings, it's really difficult because you have people come out and they'll say, I didn't agree, and they say they didn't agree for all kinds of reasons, which is, you might not approve of what I've just done, so I'm going to say I didn't really do it under my own choice. And so it becomes very curvy. So I would always try and set that up. If I knew that somebody had mental capacity, had been assessed as mental capacity to have sexual relationships, they were having private space in their room with somebody they're intending to have sex with, they had emergency plans. They knew what they could do if they weren't happy. They knew who they could call if they weren't happy. They had practiced that. So I've had a young client who exchanged sex for a ride home because she wanted a ride home one night. So I would just try and make sure that they understood what the contractual arrangements were of their time with that person. So it may be that their support workers are floating around and the care workers can be shouted at. It may be that the person pretends they need to go to the toilet. Just role play it with them, and so that they have some skills training to extract themselves from a situation they consider dangerous or that they no longer want to be in. In relation to whether or not they can consent to sex but not to contact or social relationships with somebody, so the contact issue, that to me is a contact mental capacity assessment. So you would then decide whether or not they should be having contact with that specific person or not, and that would trump the sex consent.
And I think just to add, drawing back on the example of Nadine, I think with Nadine there are some questions around those kinds of issues, around her ability to sort of a judge of character, if you like, for want of a better phrase. But in terms of setting up private time and setting up, I guess, the context for her to support her relationships, we've, as a team, been really careful to present that we're non-judgmental. We're here to provide a space for her to bounce ideas off and to support her decision making, but we're not here to judge morally, make moral judgments around particular acts or activities that she wants to do. We're there to provide information to make sure she understands and she can use it. And we've done a similar thing around practicing what the safety plan would be if she needed help, and where her support team would be, at what time they're returning, and things like that. So just going through those issues really clearly and continuing to remind her just before she's going on a date or having someone over. So we're just making sure we're giving her the best possible chance, maximising her capacity that way.
Okay, so there somebody just corrected social not intimate relationship. Well, I hope that was all clear. Okay, so the next question I've got is there any consideration in the case law when considering whether a person has capacity to consent to sex, whether the person not only understands that they could become pregnant, but also understands how to use contraception, and if they want to become pregnant, whether they understand what's involved in looking after a baby, and not only understanding that they can contract an STI, but also understanding the symptoms and signs of one and the effect on their fertility if left untreated, or are these questions considered separately? Goodness me, that's a lot of information. And again, I'm not giving legal advice on a particular case if you have a particular case in mind. I've had this arise myself, actually. I had a lovely client a number of years ago who had Prader-Willi, and she was similar to the sort of scenarios that you were talking about, Sonja. She would do things like she would exchange sex online for pizza and things, and she got involved with a young man who her care workers were slightly skeptical about, and she said she wanted to have a baby, but the clinical evidence was that having the likelihood, given her Prader-Willi, was that she would not be fertile, so that if and insofar as she was having sex to get pregnant, that couldn't happen, and that B, if she did get pregnant, there was a very high likelihood of the child being profoundly disabled and all the complications that might follow for that. That it never went through to a final judgment because a lot of the issues were compromised, and in fact she jettisoned the boyfriend, fortunately, at a certain point during the proceedings. But I did have, of course, to look at some of the case law as a result of that. On the condom point, on the contraception point, the Court of Appeal in the local authority and B case that I talked about in the end of my talk, the one that's currently under appeal to the Supreme Court, did clarify the point about contraception, because there was a previous case, it's a Southwark case of Mrs. Justice Parker, where there was some discussion about whether understanding the possibility of sexually transmitted diseases was sufficient, or whether you needed to actually understand how to use a condom and what a condom was for. And the Court of Appeal in local authority in B, because B in that case, and I think I also mentioned, said, I know about sexually transmitted diseases and I know about condoms, but it's fine because Mr. C washes his penis. He doesn't have a dirty penis, so you can't get STDs from that. And the Court of Appeal said, the only practical purpose of understanding that sexually transmitted diseases can be caused through sexual intercourse is to know how to reduce the risk of infection, since the purpose cannot be to encourage abstinence from intercourse completely. So P does need to know what a condom does and how to use one. But again, it goes back to the point that I was making before. That's something that they can learn, or should, depending on the level of their impairment, should be able to learn. So somebody shouldn't be failing a capacity assessment because nobody's explained to them how to use a condom. So that's something that can be managed quite easily. On the question of whether P needs to understand, if they want to become pregnant, what's involved in looking after a baby and what would it involve, and so on, the courts have actually looked at this also specifically. I think it's a case of Mr. Justice Bodie. Yeah, it is Mr. Justice Bodie, in case of local authority, and Mrs. A and Mr. A. And he found in that the test for capacity for contraception was the reason for contraception and what it does, the types available, the advantages and disadvantages of each type, the possible side effects, and how easily each type can be changed, and generally accepted effectiveness of each. Oh no, sorry, I think that's from an earlier case, but it was, yeah, that's from Mr. Justice Baker in local authority in P, but it was interpreted by Mr. Justice Bodie in the local authority and Mr. and Mrs. A case. as not stretching to include information as to what would actually be involved in caring for and committing to a child. And he said, you know, these are wider social consequences. Firstly, you know, the test for capacity is usually going to be carried out in the context of a GP surgery or a family planning clinic. It's going to take 30 minutes. There is not going to be an opportunity to interrogate a woman's background and therefore find out, you know, whether she does have the wherewithal, whether she has the understanding to decide to bring up a child or not, and what that might involve before you're going to give her contraception. Secondly, he said, you know, making the test wider, you're going to risk blurring the line between capacity and best interests. Because if part of the test were to involve whether the woman concerned understood enough about the practical realities of parenthood, you'd inevitably be very highly in the degree of subjectivity, and, you know, paternalism is likely to apply to that, because then you're making judgments about whether or not you think she would make a suitable parent. And, you know, nobody faces that kind of scrutiny when they go and ask their physician for contraception. So, you know, the fact that somebody lacks capacity shouldn't put them into some separate kind of category. And lastly, he said, you know, although the reasonably foreseeable consequence of not taking contraception could involve possible conception and birth and parenting a child, there has to be a limit for public policy reasons on how far you have to imagine these things, because otherwise the danger is you're getting into the area of you know, social engineering, because you're saying, you know, this person here cannot understand enough about what rearing a child should be, ergo they can't have contraception, ergo they can't have sex, and obviously that is not a place where we want to go. Emma, I can see you nodding.
It's just really reminiscent of the couple, the case example of the couple, because the concerns that led rise to the assessment being requested were around them saying they wanted to have a baby, and then the actual assessment was around the 3 questions: capacity to consent to sex, contraception and marriage, but it didn't include, I wasn't requested to assess anything around parenting ability. But some of the recommendations were around further work and sort of educational awareness raising work to be done with them around what the realities of having a child might be, but not an assessment of that as such at that point. And so I think what you just said really ties in well to what we did in that situation.
I would just add, pragmatically, when we support people who have life goals which include sexual relationships, part of that is going to be supporting them to think about foreseeable consequences like STDs, like sexual health checks, like, you know, the ability to have vaccinations against sexually transmitted diseases that could link to cervical cancer, for example. So there's, you know, it behoves us, when we know that that is part of their life goals, to add then support around that. And if we know that part of somebody's life goals is to become a parent, well, welcome to 90% of the human race. So that's going to then be something that requires education and support and thinking about what information they need to know to make an informed decision about whether or not that is something they want to go forward in their life with. So it may well be part of somebody's future care planning to think about how do we help them to gain information, and particularly when I see people who have life-changing disability, you know, there's a lot of really great YouTube people who have no arms and are taking care of an infant and things, and those things can be quite inspirational to look at. How would I overcome some of these challenges that I have in order to parent? I have been involved in a local authority assessment where the person had been pregnant and rehab to another person in the rehabilitation unit. That baby had been removed under a general anaesthetic because they were non-compliant with following the birthing procedural information from the midwife, so they had an emergency elective C-section. Then they were pregnant again to a different person within the rehab, and again the baby was removed under a elective C-section with them under a general anaesthetic. And then they had engaged in another set of relationships, at which point I got brought in to try and see whether they could consent to sex, they could consent to contraception, and they were still having access visits with these 2 infants, but it was pretty clear that it was going to be a process where they would be adopted in the longer run. And the the woman that I saw was deeply sad about that. She had this really confused experience that babies were disappearing out of her belly overnight. She had this really confused experience that she would have these, intense and important relationships with people that would end, and she was concerned about all of that. So not only did I find that she had capacity to have sexual relationships and capacity to consent to contraception, I recommended this huge extra piece of work that needed to be done, because there was this, that's not the end, that's just part of what her care plan now needs to entail.
Actually, I think that's really interesting, because I often find, you're brought in late in the picture. I'm brought in even later. Usually barristers are only involved when things have gone wrong, or they're pretty far progressed. And I think so much of these things, if you can front load some of the questioning, some of the decision making, put these care plans in place early on, educate P, support P, then you might get to the point where you never need me at all.
Can the capacity assessment be done online as per during COVID, and what challenges does this present?
Yes, it can be done online. The Court of Protection got with the 21st century and has allowed that as part of their COVID changes. But as we said, you just need to think about the appropriateness of that. You need to do this in the most person-centered way for the person you're trying to assess. And there are some people whose engagement online is going to be problematic. There are some people who are having people in the background that you can't see on the camera screen that may not be appropriate because they're influencing in the background. There may be issues about the materials you want to show and have the person engage with that are difficult. But conversely, going in PPE with your mask and your visor and all the other stuff is problematic if people are using your face to lip read and other things. So it needs to be person-centered in how you approach it. I've done some largely actually testamentary capacity, making wills, and management of finances. They're a bit more straightforward to do online, and particularly with screen sharing, so you can show them a screen and then you can type notes as you're going so they can see the kind of key information and hold it in mind. And then the final question that we had was about where this practice between the law interfaces, and as Nicola was just saying, where down the stream these things get referred to legal advisors. I think my suggestion about that would be whenever there's a dispute about the mental capacity, so somebody's made an assessment and there's a dispute about whether or not that conclusion, that opinion is shared by other people. So you may want to have a second opinion done within your service or from an external person or whatever. But at that point, you're starting to have disagreements amongst yourselves about somebody's mental capacity. That's the point to speak to legal advisors about it. I think the other time is when you are running some kind of really complex, vulnerable, safeguarding, lots of things in place where you need the court to say, yeah, we support what you are doing, or no, we think this is not legal, this is too interfering, too protectionist, too cotton woolish, let the person have a bit more autonomy. So those would be triggers for me. Nicola, do you have views about what should trigger an assessment by a lawyer?
Me rather than well, yeah. I mean, I think it's like you said. It's often, ironically, it's the moment when P starts to engage in behaviour that is beyond that which people usually anticipate. And you talked in the care home about, P starts off with they want to have sex with their husband, and then they want to have sex with the gardener and everybody else in the care home. And those are the points, obviously, when you need to be triggering a capacity assessment. But I think you're right. As soon as there's any dispute between the caregivers or the psychologist or anybody else in the treating front line, then you need to be considering about a reference to lawyers and a reference to the Court of Protection. I think that it's also important to bear in mind, and this is the point that Mr. Justice Hayden made in the LC case, which is the autistic girl pimped out by local authorities, which he said, if you've got two competing areas of capacity, so you've got a declaration that P has capacity to consent to sex, but you've also got a declaration that she lacks capacity to decide with whom she's going to have contact, then there is inherently going to be a restriction on their liberty there, because in order to keep them safe, to prevent them from having contact with people with whom they don't have capacity to make decisions, you're restricting their ability to have sex. But if you don't restrict their ability to have sex because they've got capacity there, you're exposing them to danger from people with whom they don't have capacity to make decisions on contact. So in those kind of circumstances, you know, that's when you need to be, I think, seeking legal advice and you know, making a reference to court.
Would it be fair to say that if there's disagreements between perhaps family and the team, there might be really strong family views about what a person shouldn't be doing, that could also, and it's unresolvable or feels unresolvable, that might also be somewhere to get legal advice or a court view on it?
Yeah, inevitably, because if you are in the parameters of a best interest decision, so obviously if it's sex, there's no best interest decision because either they have capacity or they don't. Section 27 of the MCA applies. Nobody can make a decision that P is going to have sex if they don't have capacity to do it. But if it's about contact, which is more frequently going to be the sort of, you know, the crunch point, or you know, whether or not they should be having a relationship with, you know, a same-sex relationship, having been apparently heterosexual for a long time, if there is a best interests decision to be made, for example on contact, then section 4 in the things to be considered in best interests includes P's wishes and feelings, but also the views of those who care for them. You know, so if you have a conflict there, then that's important for deciding making a best interest decision. And inevitably, if you can't resolve it, then it's going to require reference to the court.
We've got one final question. So from Alice, given the increased ability to meet people on the internet, has there been a corresponding increase in people with a mental impairment seeking sexual relationships remotely? How easy is it to safeguard people who are seeking sexual relationships during the pandemic and who are using the internet to meet people? And do you have sufficient resources to address these issues? I'll just copy that across so you can see that.
Well, anecdotally, I would say since maybe 2010, the internet has been very large in my work, and since the fact that nearly everybody now carries a smartphone, this has become a significant part of my work and my initial assessments with people. I often ask them about what social media platforms they may use, what images they take. Sometimes we'll have a look at what photos they've taken in the last month on their phone, and just in the process of doing that, you'll spot what's going on, particularly the platforms where there's secret parts in it, like Snapchat, where the images dissolve and you can't then get a sense of what's gone on in the background. So I think just general good clinical practice is to address it on the off. You know, this is just a normal part of everyday life. Can you use your phone to contact people you love? Can you use your phone to contact people you don't know? You know, I would just start right from the off on looking at their skills on those levels. But most certainly my experience has been during COVID that people have had different levels of understanding in my social network and in my client group about what the rules are. And so it's been a real challenge, I think, for care staff to try and support people, to try and manage who's coming in and out of properties and all those other things. I would just say it's been hard.
Yeah, I would say the same. We're experiencing similar challenges with Nadine at the moment. And again, it's really been, there hasn't been a kind of particular right or wrong way to do it, but it's really been around having the social media conversation on the table a lot of the time and normalising that lots of people use it and it's a part of most people's everyday contacts and life, but helping her to think about risks and what information she's sharing on a regular basis, really. And that's been her main, there's also been lots of positives because it's been her main way of interacting with other people outside of her team during the pandemic. But also just thinking about if that is her only way, we have less kind of knowledge of it, potentially, if it's on her phone, which should keep in private. So just a little messy, but doable.
I see some people who are locked in, so that means the only movement they can actually make is their eyes in an upward movement. And for them, the internet has made their world huge. that has enabled them to be in contact with people. They often sleep very poorly. There's always somebody awake somewhere in the world to engage with and interact with at that time of day or night. So there's definite real benefits for people in being able to connect with other people with similar conditions and similar life experience, etc. People who are interested in doing various things over the internet that are fetishes for them, etc. So there's benefits in it. It just needs to be well thought out. And then there was a part of that question which was about the resource for it. And the caveat that I would say is, you think about how much clinical resource and time is put into tissue viability, how much resource and time is put into seating assessments, how much resource and time is put into carer interviews, how much resource and time is put into blood sugar management, how much is put into somebody's sexual functioning, how much is put into somebody's desire to be a parent, how much is put into somebody's understanding about contraception. And it's almost never equivalent, right? We spend hours and hours and hours looking at the best continence aid for somebody and the best mattress for somebody, but we spend almost no time and no resource thinking about these fundamental parts of being human.
Yeah, I would just add that there is some clarification in the Re-B case. I didn't really talk about it because there's so much, but the Re-B case in the Court of Appeal touches on Mr. Justice Cobb's judgment because there are actually two cases. There's Re-A and Re-B. Re-B is about a young woman. Re-A is about a man with paedophilic tendencies who wants to go online and look at images that are criminal and are also going to expose him to the possibility of criminal prosecution. And the Re-A case was not appealed to the Court of Appeal, but it's discussed in passing and forms part of the ratio in the Re-B Court of Appeal judgment. And they do talk about what the test for capacity to engage in use social media is, and it's one of these paradoxes that it's more complex than the capacity to decide to engage in sex, so that you can have capacity to engage in sex but not to use social media. And if anybody wants to look, I can see from David that we're going over time. But if anybody wants to have a look, there is a list of things that you need to understand for capacity to engage in social media in the Re-B judgment.